Nobody believed it when they first heard the reports. A soldier who refused to carry a weapon had somehow saved 75 men in one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. But what they didn't know was that Desmond Doss had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Without even realizing it, the telegram arrived at the Doss family home in Lynchburg, Virginia, on a humid Tuesday morning in 1945. Mrs. Bertha Doss read it 3 times before the words finally sank in. Her son, the gentle boy who wouldn't even kill a spider, had been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for saving lives without firing a single shot. But this story doesn't begin with heroism. It begins with a promise made by a terrified child who witnessed something that would haunt him forever. Desmond Thomas Doss was 7 years old when he first saw his father drunk and violent. The year was 1926, and Prohibition had driven good men to desperate measures. Tom Doss, a carpenter by trade, had come home with liquor on his breath and fury in his eyes. What happened next would shape his son's entire worldview. "Give me that gun," Tom slurred, pointing at his own brother with shaking hands. "I'll show you who's boss of this house." Young Desmond watched in frozen terror as his uncle slowly backed toward the door, hands raised in surrender. The family Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its pages fluttering in the breeze from the open window. And hanging on the wall, clearly visible to the frightened boy, was a framed illustration of the 10 Commandments his mother had hung there just weeks before. "Thou shalt not kill." The words seemed to burn themselves into Desmond's young mind as he watched his father's finger tighten on the trigger. But something stopped him. Maybe it was his wife sobbing. Maybe it was the sight of his terrified son. Or maybe it was something deeper, a voice that spoke louder than anger and alcohol. Tom Doss slowly lowered the weapon, his hands trembling now for different reasons. The crisis passed, but its impact on young Desmond would echo through decades. That night, as his mother tucked him into bed, Desmond made a promise that would seem impossible to keep in the world he was about to inherit. "Mama," he whispered, "I'm never going to hurt anybody. Never." Bertha Doss smoothed her son's hair and kissed his forehead. She thought it was the sweet promise of a child who would outgrow such idealistic notions. She had no idea she was listening to the birth of a legend, but before Desmond could become the soldier who saved 75 men, he had to become the man who could save himself. And that journey was about to test every ounce of faith he possessed. 20 years later, that 7-year-old boy had grown into a young man whose convictions had only strengthened with time. While other boys his age were playing war games and talking about adventure, Desmond Doss was learning to heal. It started with small things. A neighbor's cut finger. A friend's scraped knee. His mother's chronic headaches. Desmond seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how to help, how to comfort, how to make things better instead of worse. But what nobody understood, not even Desmond himself, was that he was unconsciously preparing for the greatest test of his life. December 7, 1941 changed everything for America, and it changed everything for Desmond Doss. When the news of Pearl Harbor crackled through the radio in the Doss living room, the young man felt something stir inside him that he'd never experienced before, the call to serve. But how could a man who refused to kill serve in a war where killing was the primary objective? The answer came to him as he knelt in prayer that night, his mother's old Bible open to the book of Isaiah. "Here am I, send me." The words seemed to leap off the page, but they were immediately followed by his own limitation. "But Lord, I can't take a life." In that moment of quiet desperation, Desmond Doss discovered his calling. If he couldn't take lives, he would save them. He would become a medic. When he announced his decision to enlist as a conscientious objector who would serve as a medic, the reactions ranged from confusion to outright hostility. His father, now sober and deeply ashamed of his earlier behavior, begged him not to go. "Son, you'll be a target out there," Tom Doss pleaded. "They'll think you're a coward. They'll think you're not doing your part." But Desmond had made up his mind. On April 1, 1942, he walked into the recruitment office in Lynchburg and signed his name on papers that would send him into the heart of the world's greatest conflict, armed with nothing but his faith and his first aid kit. What he didn't know was that his real battle would begin before he ever saw combat. The enemy he would face first wasn't Japanese soldiers, it was his fellow Americans. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was a shock to the system for the quiet Virginia boy. The noise, the chaos, the constant profanity, and above all, the weapons. Everywhere Desmond looked, men were learning new and efficient ways to kill. And he was expected to be part of it. The trouble started on day one. "What do you mean you won't carry a rifle?" Sergeant Howell's voice could be heard across the entire training ground. "Every man in this unit carries a weapon. That's what makes you a soldier, son." Desmond stood at attention, his voice steady despite the 100 pairs of eyes boring into him. "With respect, Sergeant, I'm classified as a conscientious objector. I'm here to serve as a medic." The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the laughter. Not the friendly kind, the bitter, mocking kind that cut deeper than any blade. "Boys, we got ourselves a coward," someone called out from the ranks. "Hey, Yellow Belly, you gonna hide behind that first aid kit when the Japs start shooting?" Desmond felt his face burn, but he kept his expression neutral. He'd expected this, but knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier to bear. What he hadn't expected was how systematic the harassment would become. It started with small things. His bunk was mysteriously torn apart during inspections. His gear went missing. His food was seasoned with salt and pepper until it was inedible. But as the weeks wore on, the campaign against him escalated into something much darker. One night, 3 soldiers cornered him in the latrine. "We don't want you here, Bible boy," the largest one said, shoving Desmond against the wall. "When we get overseas, we need men we can count on. Not some preacher's son who's gonna get us all killed." Desmond felt the old fear from childhood rising in his throat, the same fear he'd felt watching his father with that gun. But alongside the fear was something else, a calm certainty that he was exactly where God wanted him to be. "I understand your concerns," he said quietly. "But I'm going to be the best medic this unit has ever seen. When you're hurt, I'll be there. That's a promise." The man's fist was already drawn back when Sergeant Howell's voice cut through the night air. "What's going on here?" The soldiers scattered, but the message had been delivered. Desmond Doss was not welcome in the 77th Infantry Division, but here's what none of them understood yet. The same faith that made them see him as weak would soon make him the strongest man they'd ever known. The real training was just beginning. The verbal abuse was one thing. The physical isolation was another. But what nearly broke Desmond Doss was the pressure from his own commanding officers to abandon his convictions. Captain Vernon was a career military man who had worked his way up from private. He'd seen action in North Africa and knew what war really meant. In his mind, Desmond's pacifist stance wasn't just naive, it was dangerous. "Doss, I've been thinking about your situation," the captain said during one of their weekly meetings. "I think I might have a solution that works for everyone." Desmond sat perfectly still, waiting. "There's a position available in the kitchen detail. Good, honest work. You'd be serving your country, keeping our boys fed. Nobody could call you a coward for that." Vernon's voice was almost fatherly. "What do you say?" For a moment, Desmond felt the weight of temptation. It would be so easy to say yes. No more harassment. Vernon's expression hardened. "Son, you don't understand what you're asking for. When we hit those beaches, when the shooting starts, those boys aren't going to want some conscientious objector trying to patch them up. They want killers watching their backs. Then I guess I'll have to prove them wrong, sir." The captain studied him for a long moment. "Doss, I've been in 3 campaigns. I've seen good men die because someone wasn't willing to do what needed to be done. If your conscience gets one of my boys killed," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That night, alone in his bunk while the other soldiers played cards and shared stories from home, Desmond opened his Bible to the book of Psalms. His finger found verse after verse about God's protection, about divine strength in times of trouble. But one passage stopped him cold. "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The valley of the shadow of death. That's exactly where he was headed. But the promise remained, I will fear no evil. Desmond closed the Bible and made another promise to himself. Whatever they threw at him, the harassment, the doubt, the fear, he would not give up. He would not give in. And when the time came, he would prove that a man didn't need to kill to serve his country with honor. What he didn't know was that the real test of his faith was still months away, on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where the difference between courage and cowardice would be measured not in bullets fired, but in lives saved. But first, he had to survive the rest of basic training. And that was proving harder than he'd imagined. 3 months into training, the psychological warfare against Desmond reached a crescendo that nearly destroyed him. It wasn't just the name-calling anymore. It wasn't just the isolation. It was the systematic attempt to break his spirit entirely. The campaign was led by Private Jack Glover, a tough kid from Chicago who'd grown up in the streets and had no patience for what he saw as religious weakness. Glover had lost a brother at Guadalcanal, and in his mind, every moment spent accommodating Desmond's cowardice was a betrayal of real soldiers who had died fighting. You know what you are, Doss. Glover cornered him after evening chow. You're a fraud. Hiding behind that Bible while real men do the dying. My brother didn't have a medic when he bled out on that beach. You know why? Because his medic was too busy praying to do his job. The words hit Desmond like physical blows. For the first time since enlisting, he felt his resolve wavering. What if Glover was right? What if his presence really would endanger others? That night, after lights out, Desmond lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. Around him, 40 other men slept the sleep of soldiers, fitful, always ready to wake at the first sign of trouble. But Desmond couldn't sleep at all. For the first time since making his promise as a 7-year-old boy, he began to doubt himself. The breaking point came during a field exercise 2 weeks later. The company was practicing combat maneuvers when live ammunition began flying overhead, not at them, but close enough to simulate real combat conditions. The idea was to get the men used to the sound and feel of battle. For most of the soldiers, it was just another drill. For Desmond, it was a revelation. When the first machine gun opened up, every instinct screamed at him to find cover and stay there. The noise was overwhelming, a constant staccato that seemed to shake his bones. But then he heard something that changed everything. Medic. Medic. It was just part of the exercise, a soldier pretending to be wounded to test response times. But when Desmond heard that cry, something primal took over. Without thinking, without fear, without any concern for the bullets whistling overhead, he ran. He didn't run away from the sound. He ran toward it. The wounded soldier was Private Henderson, a farm boy from Iowa who'd been one of the few men in the unit who hadn't actively tormented Desmond. When Desmond reached him, Henderson was grinning, ready to deliver some scripted description of his fake wounds, but the grin faded when he saw Desmond's face. There was no fear there. No hesitation. Just absolute, focused determination to help. Henderson later told his buddies that looking into Desmond's eyes in that moment was like looking at a different person entirely. The quiet, bookish conscientious objector had vanished, replaced by someone who seemed to glow with purpose. "What's your condition, soldier?" Desmond asked, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. Henderson stammered out his scripted injuries, but he was distracted by what he was witnessing. While bullets cracked overhead and other soldiers hugged the ground, Desmond methodically went through his medical assessment as if they were sitting in a peaceful classroom. When the exercise ended, word spread quickly through the company. Some of the men started looking at their medic differently. Not with respect yet, that would come later, but with something like curiosity. Maybe the Bible boy wasn't quite the coward they'd thought, but the real test was still coming. And when it arrived, it would transform Desmond Doss from a target of ridicule into a legend that would echo through military history. The transport ship that would carry them to the Pacific was already waiting in the harbor. The USS Henrico was a converted cargo ship that now carried 1,500 American soldiers toward their destiny in the Pacific theater. For most of the men, the 3-week voyage was a time of nervous anticipation, card games, and letters home. For Desmond Doss, it was a period of profound preparation. Though he didn't realize it at the time, the ship's sickbay became his second home. Doc Schuster, the chief medical officer, had initially been skeptical of the conscientious objector assigned to his staff. But as the days passed, he began to see something in Desmond that impressed him. "Doss, you've got steady hands," Doc Schuster observed one morning as Desmond helped treat a sailor who'd cut himself on a broken bottle. "And you don't flinch. That's good. In combat, there's no room for squeamishness." What Doc Schuster didn't mention was what he'd noticed the night before, when Desmond thought no one was watching. A soldier had been suffering from severe seasickness, not the mild discomfort most men experienced, but the violent, dehydrating kind that could be dangerous. While other men avoided the stricken soldier's bunk, Desmond had spent the entire night caring for him, holding his head, bringing him water, cleaning up messes without complaint. "That's what a real medic looks like," Doc Schuster had whispered to his assistant. "Someone who serves without being asked." But not everyone on the ship was warming to Desmond. The harassment from his own unit continued, though it had taken on a more subtle character. Nobody wanted to be caught picking on the medic by the ship's officers, but the cold shoulder and whispered comments continued. The tension came to a head one evening during what should have been a moment of reflection and hope. It was Sunday, and Desmond had quietly set up a small prayer circle on deck. He wasn't trying to evangelize, he never pressured anyone to join him. But word got out, and a few soldiers had gathered around him for evening prayers. They were reading from Psalm 91, the soldier's psalm, "He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." Private Glover and 3 of his friends interrupted the service. Well, Glover said loudly, "Look what we got here. Sunday school in the middle of a war." Desmond looked up calmly. "You're welcome to join us, Jack." "Join you?" Glover laughed harshly. "I got better things to do than listen to fairy tales. You know what I was doing? Writing a letter to my mother. Telling her about the brave soldiers I'm serving with." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Should I mention you, Doss? Should I tell her about the soldier who's too holy to fight?" The few men who had gathered for prayer shifted uncomfortably. This was exactly the kind of confrontation Desmond had hoped to avoid, but instead of backing down or getting defensive, Desmond did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stood up slowly and walked over to Glover until they were face to face. "Jack," he said quietly, "I know you lost your brother. I know you're angry. And I know you think I'm a coward. But I want you to know something." He paused, meeting Glover's hostile gaze. "When you're hurt, not if, but when, I'm going to be there. And I'm going to bring you home." That's not a threat or a challenge. It's a promise. For a moment, something flickered in Glover's eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or confusion. But it was quickly replaced by the familiar hardness. "We'll see about that, Bible boy. We'll see what kind of promises you keep when the real shooting starts." As Glover and his friends walked away, the prayer circle quietly disbanded. But one soldier, Private Rodriguez from Texas, lingered behind. "Doss," he said quietly, "I don't know much about your religion. But I seen how you been treating folks on this ship. If we get in trouble over there." He gestured toward the western horizon where Japanese-held islands waited in the darkness. "Well, I'd be proud to have you watching my back." It was the first time anyone in his unit had expressed anything like confidence in him. Desmond felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the tropical air, but as he looked out at the dark Pacific stretching endlessly in all directions, he wondered if his faith would be enough for what was coming. None of them knew yet that their destination was Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in Pacific War history, and the place where Desmond Doss would face the ultimate test of everything he believed. The transport ship plowed through the waves toward morning, carrying 1,500 American soldiers toward their destiny. By the time they saw land again, some of them would be dead. Others would be wounded. And one of them would become a legend, but first, they had to survive the landing, April 1st, 1945. Easter Sunday. The irony wasn't lost on Desmond as he crouched in the landing craft, watching the beach of Okinawa grow larger through the morning mist. Around him, 30 other soldiers checked their weapons one final time, their faces grim with anticipation. Desmond checked his own gear, medical supplies, first aid kit, extra bandages, morphine, sulfa powder. No rifle. No pistol. No grenades. Just the tools of healing in a world about to explode with violence. 2 minutes, the coxswain called out over the noise of the engine. Private Glover was sitting directly across from Desmond in the cramped boat. Their eyes met for a moment, and Desmond saw something there he hadn't expected: fear. Real, honest human fear. For the first time, Glover looked less like a tormentor and more like what he really was, a 19-year-old kid about to face combat for the first time. "Jack," Desmond called out softly. Glover looked up, his face pale. "Remember what I promised you," Desmond said. "I meant every word." Before Glover could respond, the boat lurched as it hit the beach. Go. 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 The ramp dropped and 30 American soldiers poured onto Okinawan soil, expecting to meet a wall of Japanese fire. Instead, they found nothing. The beach was empty. No muzzle flashes. No screaming artillery. Just sand and rocks and an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than gunfire would have been. "Where the hell are they?" someone whispered. The answer would come soon enough. The Japanese had learned from their earlier defeats. Instead of meeting the Americans at the water's edge where naval gunfire could massacre them, they had pulled back to prepared positions inland. They were waiting. For 2 weeks, the 77th Infantry Division advanced across Okinawa with surprising ease. They took village after village, secured airfield after airfield, and began to think that maybe this campaign wouldn't be as bloody as they'd feared. Desmond found himself busier than expected, but not with combat wounds. Dysentery, infected cuts, twisted ankles, heat exhaustion, the unglamorous casualties of military life. He moved among the men with quiet efficiency, treating each patient with the same careful attention he'd shown since training. Slowly, his reputation began to change. It started with little things. A soldier with an infected foot wound who had been dreading the painful cleaning process found that Desmond's touch was somehow gentler than the other medics. A private suffering from severe homesickness discovered that Desmond was a good listener who never judged or mocked. Word spread. When men had minor medical issues, they started asking for the conscientious objector by name, but Desmond's real test was still waiting for him, hidden in the cliffs and caves of a ridge system that would soon become infamous. The Japanese had turned these ridges into fortresses, and when the Americans finally reached them, the real war would begin. On April 29th, the company received new orders. They were to advance toward a ridge system that intelligence said was lightly defended. The ridge had a local name that the Americans couldn't pronounce, so they gave it their own name based on its most distinctive feature. They called it Hacksaw Ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Cooney gathered the company for the briefing. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we take that ridge. Intelligence tells us it's not heavily fortified. Should be a straightforward operation." But as Desmond looked through his binoculars at the towering cliff face ahead of them, something in his gut told him that intelligence was wrong. Very wrong. That night, as other soldiers wrote letters home or played cards, Desmond sat apart with his Bible open to the book of Joshua. He read about the Battle of Jericho, where God's people had conquered a seemingly impregnable fortress through faith alone. "Be strong and of a good courage, be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever thou goest." He closed the Bible and looked up at the ridge silhouetted against the stars. Tomorrow, he would discover whether those ancient promises still held true in the modern world. Tomorrow, Desmond Doss would learn what he was really made of. May 5, 1945, dawned gray and humid. The 77th Infantry Division began their assault on Hacksaw Ridge at 0800 hours, with the 1st Battalion taking the lead. Desmond climbed with them, his aid bag bouncing against his hip, his hands free of weapons but full of purpose. The ascent was harder than anyone had anticipated. The cliff face was nearly vertical in places, requiring rope climbing and careful coordination. But the most unsettling thing was the silence from above. No enemy fire. No movement. Just the sound of American boots scraping against rock and the heavy breathing of men carrying full combat loads up a 400-foot cliff. "This is too easy," muttered Sergeant Howell as they approached the top. "Where the hell are they?" Desmond was thinking the same thing. Every instinct told him they were walking into a trap, but he kept climbing. Above him, the first soldiers reached the plateau and spread out in a defensive line. For exactly 30 seconds, it looked like intelligence had been right. The ridge top seemed deserted except for scattered foxholes and abandoned equipment. Then the world exploded. The Japanese had waited until nearly 200 American soldiers were on the plateau before springing their trap. Machine gun nests that had been invisible from below opened up simultaneously. Mortars that had been pre-registered on every foot of the ridge began dropping shells with devastating accuracy. And from caves that honeycombed the cliff face, Japanese soldiers emerged like phantoms to attack from behind. The first man hit was Private Rodriguez, the Texan who had spoken kindly to Desmond on the ship. A machine gun burst caught him in the chest, spinning him around before he collapsed behind a small pile of rocks. "Medic! Medic!" The cry came from a dozen directions at once, but Desmond was already moving. While other soldiers dove for cover, he ran toward Rodriguez through a hail of bullets that seemed to part around him like the Red Sea. "Where are you hit?" he asked as he slid into cover beside the wounded man. Rodriguez's face was gray with shock, but he managed a weak smile. "Chest. Can't breathe right." Desmond's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cutting away the bloodied uniform to reveal 2 entry wounds high on the chest. The bullets had missed the heart but punctured a lung. Without immediate treatment, Rodriguez would drown in his own blood. Working by instinct and training, Desmond sealed the chest wounds and started in 4. Around them, the battle raged with terrifying intensity. Bullets cracked overhead. Mortars exploded close enough to shower them with dirt and rock fragments. But Desmond's world had narrowed to the injured men in front of him. "You're going to be okay," he told Rodriguez, his voice calm despite the chaos. "But I need to get you off this ridge." That's when Desmond looked around and realized the magnitude of the disaster. The American assault had collapsed completely. Soldiers who weren't dead or wounded were retreating back down the cliff as fast as they could move. The wounded were being left behind. In normal circumstances, that would have been the right tactical decision. A fighting retreat. Regroup. Try again later. But these weren't normal circumstances, because there was nowhere for the wounded to go. The cliff was too steep, the Japanese fire too intense. Anyone who couldn't walk was trapped. Desmond looked at Rodriguez, then at the other wounded men scattered across the plateau, then at the Americans retreating down the cliff. In that moment, he made a decision that would echo through history. He wasn't leaving. Not without every wounded man he could find. What happened next defied every rule of warfare, every principle of tactics, and every assumption about human courage under fire. Desmond Doss, the soldier who wouldn't carry a weapon, was about to become the most effective one-man rescue operation in military history. The retreat from Hacksaw Ridge was a rout. Within an hour of the initial assault, nearly every able-bodied American soldier had either been killed, wounded, or driven back down the cliff face. The ridge top belonged to the Japanese again, littered with abandoned equipment and wounded men who had been left for dead, all except for one American. The one everyone had called a coward. Desmond Doss moved through the nightmare landscape like a man possessed. Not by demons, but by something infinitely more powerful, the absolute conviction that every life was sacred, every wounded soldier was someone's son, and no one would be left behind on his watch. His first priority was Rodriguez, who was fading fast from blood loss. The nearest evacuation point was the edge of the cliff, where other Americans had rigged a rope system to lower wounded men to the base. But between Rodriguez and that rope lay 200 yards of open ground swept by constant enemy fire. Desmond made a crude stretcher from a shelter half and 2 rifles abandoned by retreating soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on him, using weapons to save life instead of taking it. He loaded Rodriguez onto the makeshift stretcher and began the slow, agonizing journey across the plateau. What should have been a suicide mission became something else entirely. Every time machine gun fire erupted around them, Desmond would drop flat, sheltering Rodriguez's body with his own. When the firing paused, he would drag the stretcher another few yards toward safety. It took 45 minutes to cover 200 yards, but somehow they made it the cliff edge. Desmond rigged a rappelling system that he'd learned in basic training but never expected to use in combat. Using ropes and equipment left behind by the assault teams, he created a lowering system that could safely transport a wounded man down the 400-foot cliff face. Lord, he prayed as he prepared to lower Rodriguez into the hands of medics below, please let me save one more. Rodriguez disappeared over the edge. A few minutes later, the rope came back up empty, along with shouts from below that the wounded man was alive and being evacuated. Point one down, but as Desmond looked back across the ridge, he realized his work was just beginning. There were wounded men everywhere. Some calling for help. Others lying silent, unconscious, or dead. And all of them behind enemy lines with no one else willing or able to reach them. What happened next was unlike anything in military history. For the next 12 hours, as darkness fell and battle continued to rage around him, Desmond Doss single-handedly evacuated wounded American soldiers from Hacksaw Ridge. Private Mitchell, shot through both legs, unable to walk. Corporal Thompson, blinded by shrapnel, calling for his mother. Sergeant Adams, got shot and delirious with pain. One by one, Desmond found them. One by one, he dragged or carried them to the cliff edge. One by one, he lowered them to safety using the rope system he'd improvised, but the most extraordinary rescue was yet to come. As dawn approached and the Japanese prepared for their own counterattack, Desmond heard a voice calling weakly from a shell crater near the center of the ridge. When he crawled close enough to see, his blood ran cold. It was Private Jack Glover. The man who had tormented him for months. The soldier who had called him a coward. And he was dying. A mortar shell had exploded near Glover's position, shredding his legs and abdomen with shrapnel. He'd been bleeding for hours, and his face was the color of old paper. When he saw Desmond approaching, his eyes widened with disbelief. Doss. What are you doing here? I made you a promise, Jack, Desmond said quietly as he began cutting away the torn uniform to assess the wounds. I told you I'd bring you home. For the first time since Desmond had known him, Jack Glover began to cry. Not from pain, though the wounds were terrible. From something deeper. Something that couldn't be treated with sulfa powder and bandages. I'm sorry, he whispered. God, Doss, I'm so sorry. All those things I said, don't worry about that now, Desmond replied, his hands steady as he worked to stop the bleeding. We'll talk about it later. After I get you off this ridge. It took every bit of medical knowledge Desmond possessed to stabilize Glover enough for transport. The leg wounds were severe but not immediately life-threatening. The abdominal injuries were another matter entirely. Internal bleeding. Possible organ damage. Without surgery soon, Glover would die. The journey to the cliff edge was the longest of Desmond's life. Glover was a big man, nearly 6 feet tall and 180 pounds. The stretcher was crude and kept catching on rocks and debris. Japanese soldiers were moving closer, preparing for their dawn offensive. And with each minute that passed, Glover was getting weaker, but somehow, impossibly, they made it. As Desmond prepared to lower his former tormentor to safety, Glover grabbed his arm with surprising strength. Why, he whispered. Why did you come back for me? Desmond looked into the eyes of the man who had made his life miserable for months, and saw not an enemy but a fellow human being in desperate need. Because that's what medics do, he said simply. We don't leave anyone behind. As the rope disappeared over the cliff face carrying Jack Glover to safety, Desmond heard the sound he'd been dreading, Japanese voices, getting closer. The enemy was preparing to retake the ridge, and he was directly in their path, but he wasn't finished yet. Somewhere out there in the growing daylight, more wounded Americans were waiting for rescue. And Desmond Doss had made a promise to bring them all home, even if it killed him. By 0600 hours on May 6th, Desmond had been operating alone on Hacksaw Ridge for nearly 10 hours. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and running low on medical supplies. His uniform was torn and blood-stained. His hands were raw from rope burns. And he was about to face his greatest challenge yet. The Japanese counterattack began at dawn with artillery barrage that made the previous day's fighting look tame by comparison. Mortars, artillery shells, and rocket fire turned the ridge top into a moonscape of smoke and flying debris. Any sane person would have found the deepest hole available and stayed there until it was over. Desmond Doss was not feeling particularly sane. In the chaos of the barrage, he heard something that made his blood freeze, the sound of wounded men calling for help. New casualties from the bombardment, mixed with men he hadn't found yet from the previous day's fighting. Moving through an artillery barrage is like trying to walk through a thunderstorm where every lightning bolt is aimed at you personally. The noise is overwhelming, not just loud, but physically painful. The concussion from near misses feels like being punched by an invisible giant. And the psychological terror of knowing that the next shell might have your name on it requires a special kind of courage, but Desmond had moved beyond ordinary courage hours ago. He was operating on pure faith now, trusting that the same God who had protected him this far would see him through to the end. His next rescue was Private Murphy, a replacement soldier who had been on the ridge for less than 24 hours before a mortar shell shredded his right arm. Desmond found him in a foxhole, semi-conscious and losing blood fast. The evacuation should have been routine by now. Desmond had made the trip to the cliff edge so many times he could do it blindfolded. But this time was different. As he dragged Murphy's stretcher across the open ground, a Japanese machine gun position opened up directly ahead of them. Bullets cracked past Desmond's head, so close he could feel the wind from their passage. One round punched through the stretcher less than 6 inches from Murphy's head. Another shredded Desmond's left sleeve without touching skin. For the first time all night, Desmond dove for cover, lying flat behind a pile of rubble with bullets snapping overhead. Desmond faced a choice. He could wait for the firing to stop, but Murphy was bleeding badly and might not survive the delay. Or he could try to move, knowing that he was almost certainly walking into his own death. In that moment, lying in the dirt with death whistling inches above his head, Desmond heard a voice. Not audible, but unmistakable. The same voice that had called to him from his mother's Bible years ago. Be strong and of a good courage. Desmond took a deep breath, grabbed the stretcher handles, and stood up. What happened next defied every law of probability and physics. Desmond walked upright across 50 yards of open ground while a Japanese machine gun fired directly at him. Bullets passed through his uniform without touching skin. Rounds hit the ground around his feet without striking him. One shot passed so close to his head that it singed his hair, but he wasn't hit. Not once. The Japanese gunner, watching this impossible display, apparently decided he was seeing a ghost and stopped firing. Desmond reached the cliff edge, lowered Murphy to safety, and turned back toward the ridge. There were still men out there who needed help. As the morning wore on, Desmond's rescues became increasingly desperate. Each trip across the ridge was more dangerous than the last as Japanese forces consolidated their positions. But with each wounded man he saved, his determination grew stronger. Corporal Williams, both legs broken by falling debris. Private Johnson, unconscious from a head wound that should have killed him. Sergeant Parker, gut shot and delirious, who kept asking for his wife. One by one, Desmond found them. One by one, he brought them home, but it was his final rescue that would complete the legend of Desmond Doss. Near the end of the ridge, in a position that had been overrun hours earlier, Desmond heard a weak voice calling in accented English, American, please. What he found there challenged everything he thought he knew about courage, compassion, and the meaning of his mission. The voice was coming from a collapsed bunker where 2 figures lay partially buried under debris. As Desmond carefully cleared away the rubble, he discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 1 American soldier and 1 Japanese soldier, both badly wounded, lying side by side in the ruins. The American was Private Foster, a quiet kid from Minnesota who had volunteered for point duty. Shrapnel from a mortar shell had opened up his chest and left arm. He was conscious but weak, his face gray with blood loss. The Japanese soldier was young, maybe 18 or 19, and had been shot through the abdomen. He was conscious too, his dark eyes filled with pain and terror. When he saw Desmond approaching, he tried to reach for a rifle that lay just beyond his grasp. For a moment, the 3 men stared at each other in silence. The American and Japanese had been trying to kill each other just hours before. Now they lay helpless, their lives depending on the mercy of a man who had never fired a shot in anger. Desmond looked from one wounded soldier to the other, his medical training warring with a lifetime of conditioning about who was friend and who was enemy. The decision he made in that moment would define not just his own character, but his understanding of what it meant to be human. He treated them both, working with quiet efficiency. Desmond stabilized Foster's wounds first, then turned to the Japanese soldier. The young man watched him with wide, disbelieving eyes as Desmond cleaned and bandaged his abdominal wound with the same care he had shown to every American. "Why?" the Japanese soldier whispered in halting English. Desmond met his gaze steadily. "Because you're hurt." It was that simple. And that complicated. Foster was easy to evacuate, just another trip to the cliff edge, another soldier lowered to safety. But the Japanese soldier presented a problem Desmond had never faced. How do you rescue an enemy combatant? How do you explain to your own side that you risked your life to save someone who was trying to kill them just hours before? The answer came to him as he looked into the young man's frightened eyes. You don't explain. You just do what's right and trust that others will understand. The evacuation of the Japanese soldier was the most surreal experience of Desmond's entire time on Hacksaw Ridge. Carrying the wounded enemy across a battlefield where American and Japanese forces were still exchanging fire, Desmond felt like he was walking through a dream. Or a nightmare. When he reached the cliff edge, the American medics below couldn't believe what they were seeing. "Doss, what the hell are you doing?" came a shout from below. "That's a Jap. He's wounded," Desmond called back. "Send up the stretcher." There was a long pause. Then, reluctantly, the equipment came up. Desmond strapped the Japanese soldier in, checked the rigging, and began lowering him down the cliff face. Halfway down, the young man caught Desmond's eye and mouthed a single word: "Arigato." Thank you. It was 1,400 hours when Desmond finally left Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese counterattack had succeeded in retaking the plateau, and there were no more American wounded left to evacuate. His mission was complete. As he rappelled down the cliff face for the last time, Desmond tried to count how many men he had saved. He'd lost track somewhere around 40, but the officers were keeping a careful tally. When he reached the bottom, Captain Vernon was waiting for him. "Doss," the captain said, his voice tight with emotion, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." "No, sir," Desmond replied quietly. "Just doing my job." "Your job?" Vernon stared at him in disbelief. "Son, you just saved 75 American lives. 75 men are going home to their families because of what you did up there. 75. The number hit Desmond like a physical blow. 75 human beings who would have died without his intervention. 75 mothers who wouldn't receive telegram notifications. 75 wives who wouldn't become widows. 75 children who would grow up with their fathers. But as he looked up at the ridge where so much blood had been spilled, Desmond felt no pride. Only exhaustion and a deep, aching sadness for all the men, American and Japanese, who hadn't made it home. The war would continue for several more months. Desmond would serve through the final assault on Okinawa and be preparing for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs ended the conflict. But his moment of greatest trial was over. The conscientious objector who had been mocked as a coward had proven that the greatest courage isn't the willingness to take life, but the determination to save it. Even when everything, training, instinct, and common sense, tells you to run the other way, especially then. 3 days later, Desmond Doss lay in a field hospital, wounded by a grenade that had exploded near his position during the final assault on Hacksaw Ridge. The injuries weren't life-threatening, shrapnel wounds to his legs and back, but they were serious enough to end his combat service. As he drifted in and out of consciousness under the influence of morphine, Desmond became aware of a steady stream of visitors. Soldiers he had saved. Officers who had doubted him. Even some of the men who had tormented him during training. Private Jack Glover was among the first to visit. He arrived on crutches, his legs still healing from the wounds Desmond had treated on the ridge. The big man from Chicago sat beside the hospital bed for a long time without speaking, just watching the quiet medic sleep. When Desmond's eyes finally opened, Glover was ready with words he'd been rehearsing for days. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "About what happened up there." Desmond tried to sit up, but the pain in his back forced him to remain flat. "Jack, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Glover's voice was firm. "I spent months calling you a coward. Making your life hell because I thought you were yellow. But what you did on that ridge." He paused, struggling with emotions he'd never learned to express. "I've never seen courage like that. Real courage. The kind that saves lives instead of taking them." The big soldier reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn Bible. "This was my brother's. He carried it at Guadalcanal. I want you to have it." Desmond looked at the offered book, then back at Glover's face. "I can't take that, Jack. That's your brother's memory." "That's exactly why I want you to have it," Glover replied. "Because you're the kind of man he was fighting for. The kind of man worth dying for." It was a scene repeated dozens of times over the following weeks. Soldiers who had dismissed Desmond as weak now spoke of him with something approaching reverence. Officers who had questioned his commitment now recommended him for every medal the army offered, but not all the visitors brought gratitude. Captain Vernon came to deliver news that hit Desmond harder than any enemy fire. Sergeant Howell had been killed in the final assault on Okinawa. The tough non-com who had been skeptical of Desmond but had ultimately come to respect him had died leading his squad against a Japanese machine gun nest. "He talked about you before the end," Vernon told Desmond. "Said he'd never seen anything like what you did on that ridge. Said if more men had your kind of faith, maybe wars wouldn't last so long." The words should have been comforting, but Desmond felt only grief. Another good man dead. Another family destroyed. Another reminder that for all his rescues, he couldn't save everyone. The psychological toll of Hacksaw Ridge stayed with Desmond long after his physical wounds healed. He had nightmares about the men he couldn't reach, the voices calling for help that he had to ignore because he was already carrying someone else to safety. He woke up in cold sweats, hearing the whistle of incoming artillery and the screams of wounded soldiers, but the worst moments came when he was awake, during the quiet times when his mind wandered back to that young Japanese soldier he had saved. What had happened to him? Had he survived his wounds? Had he made it home to his own family? Or had he been executed by American forces who couldn't understand why their medic had risked his life for the enemy? Desmond never learned the answers to those questions. But he carried them with him for the rest of his life, along with the faces of all the men he had pulled from that hellish ridge. On October 12, 1945, Desmond Doss received a telegram that changed his life forever. He had been selected to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest award for valor. He would be the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the medal. The ceremony was scheduled for the White House, where President Harry Truman would personally present the award. But as Desmond read the telegram, he felt no pride or excitement. Only a deep weariness and the persistent question that had haunted him since leaving Okinawa: had it been enough? In a war that had cost 60 million lives worldwide, what difference had one man's actions really made? The answer would come from an unexpected source, in a letter that arrived 3 days before he was scheduled to leave for Washington. The letter was postmarked from Iowa and written in the careful handwriting of someone unaccustomed to formal correspondence. It was from the wife of Private Rodriguez, the Texan Desmond had saved during the first minutes of the assault on Hacksaw Ridge. "Dear Mr. Doss," it began. "My husband Carlos told me what you did for him on that terrible day in Japan. He said you saved his life when everyone else had given up on him. I wanted you to know that because of what you did, my children still have their father." The letter went on to describe Rodriguez's recovery, his return home, and his struggle to readjust to civilian life. But it was the ending that brought tears to Desmond's eyes. "Carlos wakes up sometimes at night, calling for his medic. When I ask him about it, he always says the same thing: that man was an angel, Maria. God sent him to bring me home. I don't know much about angels, Mr. Doss, but I know that my husband is alive today because of your courage. Our children know their father because you were willing to risk everything for a stranger. That makes you a hero in our house, and we pray for you every night. It was signed simply, with all our gratitude, Maria Rodriguez and family. That letter was the first of dozens. Over the following weeks, Desmond received mail from across the country, from wives, mothers, children, and brothers of the men he had saved on Hacksaw Ridge. Each letter told a similar story: a family made whole because one man had refused to leave wounded soldiers behind. Private Murphy's mother wrote from Boston, "My son came home because of you. He's going to college now, studying to be a teacher. He says he wants to help children the way you helped him." Corporal Thompson's wife wrote from Alabama, "The doctors said my husband's blindness was permanent, but his spirit wasn't broken. He tells everyone who will listen about the medic who carried him to safety when he couldn't see to save himself." Even Private Foster's family wrote from Minnesota, "Our boy tells us you saved a Japanese soldier too. We don't understand war, Mr. Doss, but we understand mercy. Thank you for showing mercy to our son and to his enemies." But it was the last letter that affected Desmond most deeply. It arrived the morning he was scheduled to leave for the White House ceremony, and it was postmarked from Chicago. "Dear Doss," it began in Jack Glover's familiar scrawl. "I ain't good with words, so I'll keep this short. I heard about the medal. About damn time, if you ask me. But I wanted you to know something before you go to Washington and meet the president and all them important people. What you did on that ridge wasn't just about saving lives. It was about saving souls. Mine included. I spent my whole life thinking that strength meant hurting people who crossed you. You showed me that real strength means helping people who can't help themselves. I got a job now, working with kids whose fathers didn't come home from the war. Trying to teach them that there's more than one way to be a man. More than one way to serve your country. Trying to be the kind of person you were on that ridge every damn day. I know you probably don't think you're a hero. Heroes never do. But you saved more than 75 lives up there, Doss. You saved the idea that good can win without becoming evil. In a world that's forgotten how to be decent, that's worth more than all the medals they can give you. Your friend, and I mean that, Jack Glover." Desmond folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. He would carry it with him to the White House, and for the rest of his life. As his train pulled into Washington's Union Station, Desmond looked out the window at the crowds of people going about their daily lives. Businessmen hurrying to meetings. Mothers pushing baby carriages. Children playing in the parks. All of them living in freedom because young men had been willing to fight and die on distant battlefields. But for the first time since leaving Okinawa, Desmond felt at peace with his role in that terrible conflict. He hadn't taken lives, but he had saved them. He hadn't contributed to the world's hatred, but to its healing. And somehow, in ways he was still learning to understand, that had been enough. The ceremony at the White House was scheduled for the next morning. President Truman would place the Medal of Honor around Desmond's neck and speak words about courage and sacrifice that would be recorded for history. But the real measure of Desmond's achievement wasn't waiting for him in the White House. It was in the letters from grateful families, in the second chances he had given to 75 young men, and in the example he had set for anyone who believed that doing right was more important than being safe. The conscientious objector who had once been mocked as a coward was about to become a symbol of everything America claimed to stand for. And he had earned that honor not by killing, but by healing. Not by destroying, but by saving. Not by becoming a better killer, but by remaining a better man. October 12, 1945. The East Room of the White House was filled with military brass, government officials, and members of the press. But Desmond Doss barely noticed any of them. His attention was focused on the faces in the front row, his mother Bertha, his wife Dorothy, and his father Tom, the men whose drunken rage had first shown young Desmond the terrible power of violence. President Harry Truman was a man who understood war. He had served as an artillery officer in World War I and had recently made the agonizing decision to use atomic weapons to end the current conflict. When he looked at Desmond Doss, he saw something rare, a man who had found a way to serve with honor without compromising his deepest beliefs. Private First Class Desmond T. Doss, the president began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room, distinguished himself by exceptional valor above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a medical aidman with the 77th Infantry Division in the Ryukyu Islands near Okinawa. As Truman read the citation detailing Desmond's actions on Hacksaw Ridge, the medic's mind drifted back to that terrible night when he had moved through hell itself to bring wounded men to safety. But he wasn't thinking about his own courage. He was thinking about all the soldiers, American and Japanese, who hadn't made it home. He refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the many stricken, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment and there lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of a cliff to friendly hands. The president's words painted a picture of heroism, but Desmond remembered only the fear. The bone-deep terror of every moment, overcome only by the knowledge that wounded men were counting on him. The weight of responsibility that had somehow transformed a gentle conscientious objector into the most effective rescue operation in military history. Private First Class Doss was a company aidman when the 1st Battalion assaulted a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. As our troops gained the summit, a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties and driving the others back. 75 casualties. The number that would define the rest of Desmond's life. Not 75 statistics, but 75 individual human beings with names and faces and families waiting at home. 75 futures that had hung in the balance on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. He remained alone at the top of the escarpment, repeatedly exposing himself to heavy fire as he rescued the wounded, one by one, lowering them over the edge of the cliff. Alone. That word captured something essential about Desmond's experience that no citation could fully convey. The absolute isolation of being the only man willing to stay behind. The weight of knowing that every decision he made would determine whether someone's son, husband, or father would come home alive. President Truman lifted the Medal of Honor, a bronze star suspended from a blue ribbon bearing 13 white stars. As he placed it around Desmond's neck, the president spoke words that weren't part of the official ceremony. "I'm proud to award this medal to you, son. But I have to ask, what gave you the courage to do what you did up there?" Desmond looked into the president's eyes and gave the same answer he had given to every reporter, every officer, and every fellow soldier who had asked that question. "I was just trying to do my duty, sir. Save life, not take it." But as the ceremony concluded and Desmond posed for photographs with his family, he knew that his real work was just beginning. The medal was an honor, but it was also a responsibility. People would look to him now as an example of something they believed America stood for. The question was whether he could live up to that expectation. Over the following decades, Desmond would discover that the story of Hacksaw Ridge had taken on a life of its own. He would receive thousands of letters from people inspired by his example. Veterans struggling with the moral weight of their wartime actions. Young men facing military service who wondered if it was possible to serve without killing. Conscientious objectors who had been told they were cowards and needed to hear about someone who had proven otherwise, but perhaps the most meaningful correspondence came from an unexpected source. In 1955, 10 years after the war's end, Desmond received a letter postmarked from Japan. It was written in careful English and signed by someone named Hiroshi Yamamoto. "Dear Mr. Doss, I do not know if you will remember me. I was the Japanese soldier you saved on Hacksaw Ridge. The young man you treated with the same care you showed your own countrymen. I have spent 10 years trying to find your address so I could thank you properly for saving my life. When the war ended, I was held as a prisoner until 1946. American doctors completed the treatment you began on the ridge, and slowly I healed. But the deeper healing, the healing of my understanding of what it means to be human, began when you chose to see me not as an enemy, but as a person in need of help. I returned to Japan and became a doctor myself. I have spent the last 9 years treating patients in Hiroshima, helping survivors of the atomic bomb. When they ask me why I chose this work, I tell them about an American soldier who taught me that mercy knows no nationality. I have named my first son Tadashi, which means righteous one. I tell him the story of how his life was made possible by a man who proved that the greatest strength is the strength to show compassion to your enemies. I know that our countries were at war, and I know that many people on both sides did terrible things. But I also know that in the midst of all that darkness, you chose to be a light. That choice saved more than my life, it saved my faith in humanity. Thank you, Mr. Doss. Not just for the medical treatment that saved my body, but for the example that saved my soul. The letter was accompanied by a photograph, a young Japanese doctor in a white coat, standing beside a hospital bed where an elderly Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivor, was receiving treatment. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "The ripple effect of one man's mercy." Desmond kept that letter and photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. Whenever people asked him about the significance of his actions on Hacksaw Ridge, he would show them the picture and say, "This is why we save lives instead of taking them." You never know how far that mercy will spread. The conscientious objector who had once been mocked as a coward had become something far more important, proof that it was possible to be brave without being violent, to serve without killing, and to win by refusing to hate. In a world that seemed to believe strength could only be measured by the damage you could inflict, Desmond Doss had shown that true strength was measured by the healing you could provide. And on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, in the space of 12 hours, he had proven that one man's faith could indeed move mountains. Even if those mountains were made of hatred, fear, and the seemingly impossible distance between enemies and human beings, the soldier who saved 75 men without firing a single shot had done something more than rescue individuals. He had rescued the idea that good could triumph without becoming evil, that victory could be achieved without vengeance, and that the greatest heroes were not those who destroyed their enemies, but those who transformed them into something resembling friends. In the end, that may have been the most important battle won in all of World War I. In memory of Desmond Thomas Doss, 1919 to 2006, and the 75 soldiers whose lives he saved on Hacksaw Ridge, May 5 to 6, 1945. His story reminds us that the greatest courage is not the willingness to take life, but the determination to save it, especially when everything tells you to run the other way.